Space Marine 2 is here, and I've been bringing the Emperor's Mercy to Xenos and heretics across 2 planets ever since early access release to bring you my initial impressions and review, as well as some beginner tips. Let's get into it. Mostly spoiler-free TLDR incoming. Space Marine 2 is a third-person shooter from Saber Interactive. These are the same devs who brought you World War Z. And that seemingly unrelated title is relevant here because they make great use of the Swarm engine to accurately capture the inevitable cosmic horror of Tyranid hive fleets. Space Marine 2 remembers that video games are meant to be entertaining, first and foremost. And it delivers that in spades. Through unapologetic Saturday morning cartoon or Xbox 360 and PS3 era glory. There's some problems, to be sure, with the combat flow and HP and armor upkeep at times due to the parry, dodge, and gun reaction systems, and while I've personally not experienced them, I do hear that there's some server issues during early access. Hopefully those will be sorted out at or shortly after launch. I played on PC, and there weren't any crashes or notable performance dips on my machine throughout the entire playthrough. Visuals and sound design are excellent. 10 out of 10. No notes. Honestly, if all you wanted was the TLDR here on whether it's worth a buy, I'd say it's a resounding yes for the base game, with a definitive maybe for the additional content, depending on how you feel about things after a dozen or so hours. So, stick around if you like for more detailed thoughts and some tips. Otherwise, thanks for listening to the TLDR version. And before you go, do me a solid by hitting like or dropping a "For the Emperor" or "Death to the Corpse Worshippers" in the comments. It might be fun to see which side wins here. At first glance of the game, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's a reskin of Gears of War, but there's no cover system here. Instead of cowering behind a random beige, brownish, chest-high wall, you stay topped off on health and armor by eviscerating enemies in close combat through frustrating at times, but incredibly cinematic combat system that, at its best, makes you a transhuman killing machine conductor in a symphony of death. Gameplay has weight without feeling clunky most of the time, although the parry-dodge system does seem to get overwhelmed when you're surrounded. The Warhammer nerd in me is mostly happy, honestly, with how close things are to the source material, though I'm never going to be happy about being a Smurf. I'm sorry. You've got 3 game modes on offer. Campaign, Eternal War, which is your 6v6 PvP with your standard team deathmatch control and capture the thing game modes, and Operations, the game's co-op PvE missions. The campaign clocked in at around 8 hours for me, which is plenty to sate the power fantasy without overstaying its welcome. Let me save you some frustration here. This right here? If you're playing solo with the AI companions, this is a lie. I played the first 40-ish% of the game on Veteran and spent most of my time in that 40% feeling like my ceramite armor was tissue. After a particularly frustrating defend the generator mission, I dropped it down to normal and immediately felt as though Titus's power level was more lore accurate and the overall gameplay experience was just miles better. Side note here, I'm pretty sure my neighbors across the street now know about my hatred of stagger mechanics and zoanthropes after that one. But, if nothing else, it should make neighborhood parties interesting. At the time of record, there aren't any extra benefits or unlocks from clearing higher difficulty levels on the campaign, so unless you're going in with friends, spare yourself the frustration and just enjoy the power fantasy while still feeling like you need to work for it sometimes in normal. The story does tie up loose ends quite nicely from the first game, and leaves the ending open to further developments. Hopefully, we don't need to wait another 13 years for the next game. The Operations are really where I can see myself spending easily several dozen hours with the title. Each of the 6 classes has their own progression, which seems like it demands investment without being excessively grindy, and the vibe I get when I look at it is that the game actually respects your time, which is cool and rare, and I appreciate it. As once you reach higher difficulties, the XP really does kind of pour in, especially if you keep an eye out for the optional objectives and collectibles during your run and aren't just like, nope, gotta go from A to B. Team comp does have the potential to be frustrating and imbalanced, especially if you play with randoms, so being comfortable with and leveling multiple classes will pay dividends here. Realistically, so long as your team covers the basic roles of ad clear, Majoris and Extremis DPS, and tank/utility, you should be fine overall, and your own willingness to gap fill will drastically increase completion rate and total fun factor. Real quick here, purple upgrade mats come from the 3rd tier of difficulty, by the way. It'll make sense when you look at it. The game doesn't do a great job of explaining the upgrade and progression systems, and this is one of those times where a couple of those are nested in on top of each other. Of the 3 modes, I've spent the least amount of time in PvP, partially because I'm uninterested in third-person shooter PvP due to the trauma that was shotguns everywhere in Gears of War rolling around a corner and insta-giving you, and also partially because that's not why I was interested in either of the Space Marine titles. For me, the game has really always been about that co-op PvE experience. Eternal War seems okay, but if you want in-depth opinions about the state of PvP, I'm not your cephalopod. Each class has its own progression tree here, separate from the operations mode, and both feed the treadmill of cosmetic unlocks. On that note, cosmetics are really pretty plentiful, if you're purposeful in completing the trials for each class and routinely finish matches. And from my experience thus far, everything is tied to in-game actions. So if you want some particularly badass armor pieces, emblems, or your fancy good boy medals, purity seals, get out there and earn them. You don't get to buy your way here. In terms of areas that don't quite hit right or are a bit of a love-hate relationship for me, there's really only 2 complaints I have. First, when it works, the dodge, parry, and reaction shot mechanics feel amazing. When they don't, either because of a personal skill issue or getting stagger-locked with that zoanthrope rant I went on earlier, they are some of the most profoundly frustrating moments in gaming that I have had this year. Weirdly, and this is only a campaign thing, you don't get iframes for the reaction shots, but you do for parries, perfect dodges, and executions. Maybe this is a bug? I don't know. It doesn't show up in operations. Secondly, the UI for character and weapon progression as well as cosmetic customization is clunky, especially on controller. Hopefully there's an update pass in the near future to make things a bit clearer and more intuitive or explicit as appropriate. So really, that's it. Honestly, I'm not a huge fan of numerical scoring systems, especially in our current world where IGN will hand out a 7 out of 10 to mean that the game was unplayably bad, or like wholly lukewarm, or the sequel to Superman 64. There's some flaws here, to be sure. But if you want more of the bombastic combat from the first game, with meaningful updates for what we expect in 2024, with good attention to detail for the equally bombastic and satirical source material in a package that can easily hit that $1 per hour of entertainment mark, you can get all that here, while feeling and looking pretty damn epic while you're doing it. Only if it wasn't Smurfs. I've been Bold Squid. See you next time.